So my background, my family was sort of Labour through and through. We went to like classic kind of left-wing CND marches, Labour activists. I remember going kind of leafleting with my dad when he was a Labour activist back in the day. And so it's always kind of been my home is the Labour Party in the UK. So I know, I've gone on a bit of a journey since, but I know that psychology really, really well. I know that tendency on the left to make judgments about people based on their views. Like that was part of my psychology for quite a while when you're growing up. It's like, oh, is that person a Tory? Is that person a Conservative? Or this sort of checklist of the acceptable views to have, and then kind of checking against it and being like, oh, is that person, is that person good or bad? This kind of implicit kind of othering that the left does, and I think is that force that has kind of run rampant says so much about what's going wrong in culture at the moment. And in like the big film that kind of we pretty much started off Rebel Wisdom, Glitch in the Matrix, really, I mean, I mentioned in that how the post-2016 realization had been that that's effectively what had driven Trump and driven Brexit, was this realization that there was a sort of liberal worldview that considered itself to be really, really inclusive, really, really compassionate, but actually was very dismissive and very judgmental towards a whole swathe of the population, and was this sort of hidden tribalism of liberalism. And that's been something that I've gone on a real journey around and been very outspoken on Facebook. Like I've been, after Corbyn was elected in 2015 as leader of the Labour Party, and I saw how many of the people around me, how many of my friends, how many of the people in my filter bubble were supporting him, I was like, actually, filter bubbles are an existential threat, and I'm going to start speaking out. And I've been, so what I see Corbynism as, and I'm going to post an article below here where someone I know a little bit, David Hirsch, wrote about the politics of Corbynism in 2015. I think it's still the best thing that was ever written about it, because he basically said Corbynism styles itself as being compassionate and being inclusive and being on the side of the many, but actually in practice what Corbynism does is it otherizes anyone who doesn't agree with their particular narrative and their particular view on the world. And I think that's absolutely true. I think that's been borne out by all of the experiences that I think a lot of us have seen on social media, like how toxic and nasty the Labour Party has got for people who are considered other. That's kind of undeniable. And also how much it had then was widely rejected by the working classes, by all of the traditional Labour supporters. Labour has been decimated in the seats where it was strongest. And I think that kind of wake-up call, you have to kind of look at that and see why has that happened.
So I've been on quite a different political journey to most of my friends, in that I started fairly left-leaning and then started exploring a lot of particularly libertarian ideas, anarchist ideas, and started moving increasingly to a space where it became difficult to define, is it left or right? For example, I really value individual liberty extremely highly. However, I also believe in a social safety net. So, saying I'm a libertarian also doesn't feel quite accurate. But what is interesting about it for me is that on days like today, when a lot of my friends are gnashing their teeth and pulling their hair out and feeling very kind of upset about the result, and not understanding why people might have voted in that way, that's the key thing. I often feel I have an understanding of that because I share a lot of the core values that a lot of people might be acting on when they're voting for things that my friends don't understand. So I think the easiest way for me that I found to frame it is Jonathan Haidt's work. So Jonathan Haidt he's a moral psychologist, I think is the best way to describe him. He wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, which is incredibly useful to look at, why are we so righteous about our political beliefs? And he's done a lot of research looking at the core moral foundations that we have and looking at morality in general. So there's a lot, so really big with liberal, let's say, that's again a loaded term, but liberal people is care, like caring for others, which obviously we all care about. But it's ranks very, very highly. And his point is that there are other, let's say, moral taste buds. So there's fairness cheating, loyalty and betrayal, there's authority and subversion, there's liberty and oppression, and sanctity and degradation. And Conservatives tend to rank roughly evenly on a lot of those. So it becomes very difficult for someone to, from one moral value system, which you're born with in a lot of ways. You know, it doesn't make you better or worse where you land on these, no more than your sexuality makes you a better or worse person. It's just how you're geared up. And, you know, I personally, temperamentally, I'm geared up much higher on a lot of those other moral taste buds. So I have a certain understanding of, okay, I understand why someone might care about being loyal to your country, or why someone might care about the sanctity of the nation state, or whatever it might be. While I might share different politics, it makes sense to me. And what I've noticed with this election in particular is a lot of people in my particular bubble just not being able to understand how anyone could think differently. How could anyone vote conservative because they don't care about people? It's like, well, everyone cares about people. They just care in different ways. Everyone cares about fairness. That's ingrained all the way. I mean, chimpanzees, Frans de Waal wrote a great book, or several great books around animal empathy. Dogs have empathy. Like, we all have empathy. We all care about other people. We just express it in different ways. We express fairness in different ways. And understanding that, I think, is absolutely key for this political moment right now.
Yeah, and Jonathan Haidt's work, I think, maps on really well to Ken Wilber's kind of integral framing, because if you understand that people have different views based on instinctive temperaments, inbuilt temperaments, then you start to get a meta perspective naturally that there are different perspectives, and different perspectives have different values. I love what Jordan Greenhall said, I think it was in the original Glitch in the Matrix film, where he said that what we've done through social media is we are splitting off into tribes based on temperament, and that could be an extinctionary trajectory, because we're only particularly effective in groups of mixed temperament. That's how we're built. We're designed to work together in groups of mixed temperament. And what we've done is kind of weaponized temperament against each other and then polarized into these different fragmented groups. And that could very well be an extinctionary trajectory for mankind. I think that's a really beautiful kind of idea of how we're splitting society. And now we've started talking about integral theory. I think it's good to bring in Ken Wilber's framing, because I think it really talks very well to what's going on, particularly with what he calls green, postmodern, liberal consciousness, and why it's basically, in his view, kind of collapsed in on itself, which I think is played out perfectly in what we've seen with the Corbyn wave, and how it's now kind of collapsed in on itself.
What's getting left out is you have this green multicultural egalitarianism that's being taken to such extremes, it's really becoming absolutistic in its view. So you have absolutistic to multiplistic to relativistic. And the problem with relativistic is it becomes very open to what's called performative contradictions. It becomes very open to self-contradictory statements. It does it almost all the time. So it'll maintain, for example, that it is universally, undeniably true that there is no universal truth. It'll maintain that all knowledge is social construction. It's all an interpretation. It all depends upon which culture it's arising in. And yet everything that I just said that represents the green point of view, it maintains that its view is not culturally constructed. It's true for all people at all places at all time. It's not a matter of interpretation. It's got real truth. Nobody else has truth, because objective truth doesn't exist. But that view itself is held to be objectively true by the postmodernists. So they do get caught up in this enormous kind of contradiction. And they do tend to absolutize their view. There are two ways you can end up at absolutistic beliefs. One is that you're just on your way up through the growth stages yourself, and you're at that stage, and people, by the way, can stay at that stage for the entire adult life. The fact that we have higher stage doesn't mean that you have to develop there. It's one of the problems. But so they'll have that absolutistic view just because they're on the way of passing through it. But if at any higher stage you latch onto a view with such absolute, uncritical absolutism, you can start to regress to the actual absolutistic stage. Because that's where you feel right. That's where you feel, yeah, this is, I know I've got it right. This is it. So you end up regressing to an absolutistic, ethnocentric stage. And the problem with that is that it is ethnocentric. It is tribal. And identity politics lends itself to tribalism, because what you're emphasizing is your particular tribe. And you'll know if you're doing that from a world-centric stance if when you talk about your tribe, in addition to whatever important differences there are, you also talk about what your tribe has in common with all the other tribes. Then that's world-centric. There's a unity in diversity with that. But if you just talk about your tribe and how it's different from all the other tribes, and there's some sort of special attention, that's ethnocentric, absolutistic tribalism.
So I think Ken Wilber's point around this kind of absolutism that comes with these developmental stages is really key, because each of the stages up until the second tier, when people we become able to see and hold multiple perspectives, each stage up until then, the argument goes, tends to think it's right. It's like, I'm right about the way I see the world, and it's impossible to see it in any other way. We're the good guys. You know, and again, that's something I see very often, I think, in any election that comes up.
And there is a paradox in, so integral is, the idea in integral is that we're able to see and appreciate multiple perspectives. The paradox is that green, postmodern, often thinks that it's integral. Like you see that stages thing all the time, that green thinks that it's integral because it will accept people from whatever background, from whatever gender, sexuality, as all equal, and that's a valuable perspective, but they mistake that for being integral, because ultimately there's actually a hidden tribalism there, because they're othering and rejecting anyone that doesn't agree with them about their particular perspective.